Hello, where's the rest of my head? Oh, it's the way that the Zoom window is. Whatever. Hello, hello, and welcome to another fun-filled edition of Adam's Music Box. And today I want to talk about the band XTC. Ecstasy, get it? Haha, lots of puns. But no humor is allowed today because we're talking about some of the very serious developments in the genre that we can broadly call new wave. Now, New Wave was something that grew out of the minimalism that was inspired by the punk music that came out of the mid and late 70s. Much like punk before it, New Wave has origins on both sides of the Atlantic. Punk obviously was generally credited with being a New York genre that tended to fly under both the national and international radar in its early days, despite making a big splash in the Big Apple. Think bands like the New York Dolls, think bands like the Ramones, who eventually did have some pop success, but nothing compared to, the bigger bands of the era, your Zeppelins, your Bad Companies, your Doobie Brothers. At the same time, a punk scene, or not at the same time, but a few years later, a punk scene was developing in London. And the most sort of world famous example of this was obviously John Lydon, Johnny Rotten, and the Sex Pistols, with many others following thereafter, The Clash being one of the more popular ones. But while punk's rise and fall happened rather rapidly, New Wave was something that came in and sort of filled that void. Punk obviously didn't go away, and in fact, in cities like LA, the early 80s was a huge time for punk. The punk craze got to LA years after New York and London, but once it was there, it coincided with the birth of New Wave. And New Wave really began as an attempt to create a bit more of a melodic interpretation of the minimalism that was associated with punk. And so with this sort of birth of new wave, you had bands on both sides of the Atlantic. You had Talking Heads, you had Blondie, you had those were both American bands. I know Blondie were from New York. I think Talking Heads were too. Don't quote me on that. Elvis Costello and the Attractions, they were from the UK. The Cars and Devo from America, as were the B-52s. Then you had things like The Cure, the early Cure, early Duran Duran, early Smiths, early Ultra, well, all Ultravox, really, Gary Newman, Echo and the Bunnymen, and of course XTC on the other side of the Atlantic. And even though both styles were different. The American style was a bit more cheerful, the English style was a bit more gloomy, but all of it really embraced a lot of wit, a sense of fun, but also a sense of if you have too many Journey, Boston, or Foreigner albums on your shelf, or if you've ever been to an Emerson, Lake and Palmer concert, you might not be cool enough to attend one of our gigs. Of course, music is a very accepting community, the most accepting in the world, but that was sort of the subtext that went on. As the 70s became the 80s and the early 80s became the mid 80s, a lot of these bands became increasingly melodic and even developed a kind of modernized version of the stadium rock that they originally rebelled against. Because of the sort of minimalist nature of a lot of the early new wave material, it wasn't really economically viable to put in big stadiums, big arenas, or even certain big theaters. And that's because the music didn't lend itself to that architecture, the acoustical properties, the visual properties associated with the big arenas that sort of demand something sort of more grand and theatrical rather than intimate and minimalistic. And so a lot of these bands were very good at adapting. The Cars went from the clubs of New York and other cities in which they were traveling to playing huge arenas, and their music got more melodic and even slower at times as a result. The same could be said for Duran Duran, who were probably the most successful band that began in the new wave scene, but transitioned to a form of more melodic stadium rock, but one that was still very much grounded in the essence of new wave, very synth heavy, not many solos, not a lot of major guitar riffs. So in that sense, they remained true to the new wave musical ethos, but because they created songs songs that were a bit more bold and had a bit more sonic sheen, if you will, and a bit more melodic, they were able to become a kind of stadium rock band. Simple Minds, who started out extremely avant-garde, followed a similar route. But the reason I want to talk about XTC is they took the opposite route. They were a new wave band that I think really remained true to the spirit of new wave, which is we don't really care about the audience. We care about ourselves and the people that can relate to us. We're going to play music as avant garde as we want to be, as out there in an intimate sense, though, as we want it to be. And what you see in the trend of XTC albums from the beginning, when White Music and Go To were a bit more punky, to Drums and Wires and Black Sea, that were a bit more transitioning into a more familiar genre of new wave, to their following albums, their later albums, that were really going so avant-garde. And each one, English Settlement, Murmur, The Big Express, Skylarking, each one was more avant-garde than the next. They were doing the opposite of what almost every other major new wave band were doing. They were going further into minimalism, further into experimental sounds, further into found sounds, further into music with a beat, but that you couldn't really dance to. And because of that, and because they were treated very poorly from the commercial side of the business, some very sad stories to read there, they never really got the huge acclaim of others. I mean, Depeche Mode were very clever. They found a way to be both gloomy and intimate, but also extremely danceable. And not just sort of the man dancing with his head looking at his shoes, making sure the shoelaces don't come untied, but Depeche Mode were able to get females to dance while still being gloomy. Mad scientists. XTC, though, never compromised in any sense, and even into the late 80s, they maintained this ethos of increasingly experimental sonic palette, a very intimate, quirky, and witty sense of lyricism, and a refusal to tour. Like Steely Dan and the Beatles before them, they retreated to the studio, which probably only increased their sense as a cult band. But if you really want to point to new wave that didn't, I'm hesitant to use the word, but sell out to the more melodic sensibility of stadium rock, that is XTC. Love it or otherwise. As always, like, subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Take care.